From 1924 to 53, Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union. Back in 1913, Stalin published a famous pamphlet called Marxism and the National Question, in which he argued that the Jews should not be considered a nation because they did not have a national territory. The Jews are not a real nation argument would come to be a cornerstone of Soviet orthodoxy. In the early years of the USSR, many other non-Russian minorities were recognized as legitimate nations and were, in theory, going to be given cultural autonomy and, in some cases, recognition of their historical territorial homelands within a framework of Soviet rule. Side note, having Stalin decide that your people was a real nation wasn't always a blessing. Stalin mass deported some of these nations if he found them threatening to his power. Soviet policy on the status of the Jews broke with the beliefs of the Socialist Jewish Workers' Party known as the Bund, which was a major player in the pre-revolutionary communist movement. The Bund had demanded recognition for Jewish cultural autonomy in a future communist state. But the USSR pursued a different plan, the mass assimilation of Soviet Jews through the destruction of Jewish cultural and religious institutions. Jewish resistance against that plan was denounced as part of an international Jewish and imperialist conspiracy against the Soviet Union. Stalin's fear and distaste for the Jews was deep-seated, but his fear and suspicion of other minorities was just as intense. He repeatedly implemented mass deportations and cultural erasure. He expelled 8 different nationalities from their homelands, moving 3.3 million people from westernmost parts of the USSR to Siberia and Central Asia. Roughly 40% died during the journey or due to harsh conditions in their new remote lands. In just 3 days, in May 1944, 200,000 Crimean Tatars were loaded onto cattle cars and railed to Uzbekistan. Earlier, between 1929 and 1932, Stalin launched a campaign against an economic class of small landholding, moderately prosperous peasants known as kulaks. He deported almost 2 million people under dangerous conditions, and about 600,000 of them died. Add to this list of atrocities the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938. Stalin used the secret police to set up show trials and summarily execute huge numbers of Soviet citizens whom he imagined to be traitors and spies. He killed off almost all his political rivals, many of the USSR's best overseas intelligence officers, and most experienced army commanders. One historian wrote that Stalin's reign was, quote, a paranoid delusional system imposed on an entire society. Stalin orchestrated the massive expansion of the Gulag system of forced labor camps, many located in remote, freezing regions. 18 million people suffered in this massive network of hellholes, and at least 1.5 million of them died. Stalin's network of mass incarceration took multiple forms: forced labor camps, prisons, and psychiatric prisons. In order to make his totalitarian system of state-sponsored surveillance, mass incarceration, and social control work, Stalin needed a massive system of efficient transportation, railroads and roads, and an administrative system capable of uprooting and shipping hundreds of thousands of people enormous distances quickly. I'll give you a moment to read the words on your screen. For Soviet Jews, the development and successful implementation of this transportation system made it clear that they could be collectively deported at Stalin's will. Jews knew what the Nazis had done with their massive, efficient train system, and in the years immediately following World War II, with the recent history of the Nazi Holocaust so fresh, they recognized this new form of state-controlled technology as the potentially genocidal weapon that it was. They also knew that when it had suited Stalin, he had been Hitler's ally, and that Stalin's suspicions of the Jews included a fear that Jews might be something uniquely threatening to his grip on power, that they might in fact be a uniquely transnational nation of questionable loyalty and dangerous ties to Westerners. From the 20s through the 40s, Stalin used the Gulag system primarily against other groups he distrusted or feared, though large numbers of Jews were swept along in the process. For instance, in 1940 to 41, Stalin deported 1.2 million conquered Poles to the gulags. About 280,000 of them were Jews. Many who knew Stalin well, including his daughter and his successor Khrushchev, disclosed how Stalin's long-standing anti-Semitism grew into a consuming obsession during the last 5 years of his life, 1948 to 53. A decade before this period, back in 1938, Stalin had closed all schools, over 750, where the language of instruction had been Yiddish. From 48 to 53, his government went into overdrive, targeting the Jews as a threat to the USSR. Stalin banned Yiddish books and newspapers entirely, and closed the Central Jewish Publishing House in Moscow. Newspapers and scholarly articles flooded the communist bloc, repeating that the Jews are not a nation, and that those who claimed otherwise were engaging in counter-revolutionary propaganda. Stalin had synagogues and yeshivas shut down. He had a rolling purge of Jews take place from political and diplomatic ranks, from universities, from the army, and from key professions. Stalin had the best-known Soviet Yiddish writers, poets, stage actors, and artists arrested, and on August 12, 1952, a group of 13 of them were executed after a swift conviction on false charges. In 1949, Stalin orchestrated a wave of show trials in Eastern Bloc states, alleging for the first time an international Zionist, imperialist, and American conspiracy involving prominent communist Jewish leaders. At the end of World War II, Stalin had, for strategic reasons, directed the USSR to vote in favor of the 1947 UN partition plan establishing a Jewish state in part of British-run Palestine. And he likewise offered immediate formal recognition of Israel the day it declared independence in 1948. But soon thereafter he concluded that the new Jewish state was leaning towards the West, not the Soviet bloc as he had hoped, and his policies towards Jews, Israel, and Zionism became fiercely hostile. By the beginning of 1949, Stalin's campaign of accelerated cultural genocide against Soviet Jews came to include a massive propaganda campaign vilifying Zionism as part of a capitalist American Nazi conspiracy to destroy the USSR. Let's look at how these 5 years played out. It was a period with heavy use of coded language, dog whistles, and dehumanizing terms regarding Jews, Israel, and Zionism. Zionists were frequently referred to as bourgeois nationalists. Rootless cosmopolitans was the code word for Jews whose allegiance was suspected of being primarily to other Jews, especially those in capitalist societies. They were depicted as people whose values threatened communist unity and solidarity. The term Talmudists was frequently used to refer to Jewish intellectuals who were accused of counter-revolutionary thought. Many of the publications printed during this time would make references to New Testament anti-Jewish language, as well as just gross dehumanizing language. The USSR and its satellite states implemented a relentless campaign of mass media hysteria over the threat Jews posed to the survival of the USSR. This campaign was accompanied by a series of high-profile exposés of supposed Jewish-led spy rings, reaching into the highest levels of communist society. Headlines exploded on communist bloc newspapers, followed by sensational show trials in which the mostly Jewish defendants would present coerced confessions. Public hangings would follow the trials, along with editorials and academic journals and local workers' meetings presenting urgent calls upon all good communists to be more vigilant, to look out for the people in their lives who may be enemies of the state, who might be trafficking in bourgeois nationalism or rootless cosmopolitanism. There were thousands of publications involved in this non-stop effort, from Moscow to the smallest of towns. The impacts were huge on the more than 2 million Jews living in the Soviet Union after World War II. Then comes the most famous of these baseless conspiracies turned into a spectacular show trial, the Doctor's Plot, which blew up the front pages of the leading Soviet papers, Pravda and Izvestia, on January 13, 1953. The Doctor's Plot was an organized massive hoax planned and directed by Stalin that accused a group of prominent Jewish doctors of having intentionally given improper medical treatments to several now deceased high-ranking Soviet officials in order to murder them. The accusations claimed that these doctors did this as part of a conspiracy involving international Zionism, American intelligence, and other imperialist powers seeking to weaken Soviet leadership before launching a war to destroy the USSR. Stalin's plan began with the screaming headlines of January 13th, and then phased into hundreds of other Soviet and Soviet-sponsored media platforms repeating similar versions of the blockbuster story. Immediately, Jews across the USSR and in the Eastern Bloc were targeted by their peers in government agencies, factories, and in research facilities as possible spies. Even though Stalin had denied Jews the status of being recognized as a true nation, Jews nevertheless were listed as Jewish under the nationality category on their ID papers, resulting in Jews facing the worst of both worlds, not being enough of a distinct minority nation to merit collective autonomy and protected status for Jewish cultural and religious institutions, but being just enough of a distinct minority, and an historically distrusted one at that, to be stuck in a permanent second-class status in the wider society. Some of the impacts that followed the Doctor's Plot headlines of January 13th, 1953 included a series of additional arrests followed by show trials of predominantly Jewish defendants accused of similar kinds of conspiratorial plots against various communist states, all linked to Zionism, American imperialism, and other forces plotting to overturn communism. Jews in urban centers began to burn their Yiddish books. Jews on professional staffs, medical, military, engineering, university, etc., began to be fired in large numbers. And the Jewish population throughout the USSR had to prepare for the possibility of deportation to the gulags or to sparsely populated remote regions. They also had to worry about the possibility of public riots and vandalism due to the long-standing history of suspicion and hatred of Jews that had resulted in pogroms in the pre-Soviet past. Social shunning, widespread harassment by neighbors, beatings, public expressions of hatred and suspicion of Jews all spiked. Just as one example, in Zhytomyr, Ukraine, 20 Jewish doctors were arrested, and the newspaper there's lead op-ed said, all these Kohanes and Grinsteins, the Kaplans and Polyakovs, aroused the profound loathings of the people. As the contemporary writer Isabella Tabarovsky states, Jews living in the Soviet Union saw their culture and religion decimated, educational and professional opportunities depleted, and became licensed targets of casual grassroots anti-Semitism. Stalin had planned multiple acts to this carefully scripted series of episodes of political theater. During this time, Stalin's health had been visibly deteriorating, and the worse it got, the more his paranoia grew. Members of Stalin's inner circle were unsure where Stalin was ultimately going with the Doctor's Plot campaign, but they knew that it was going to be grand in scale, possibly heading towards a new round of top-tier purges, and any of them could be victims. According to several of the people involved, including 3 former Politburo members, Stalin's endgame was the mass deportation of all Soviet Jews, as many as 3 million people, to the remote lands of the East. Now, there remains some debate about whether this mass deportation plan was real, or if it was real, whether or not it was already well developed. But 6 weeks after the headlines announcing the Doctor's Plot had broken, Stalin died. And then a surprising thing happened. Not long after Stalin's death was announced, the Soviet government, for the first time in its history, announced that leaders of the Soviet government had completely fabricated the Doctor's Plot, that it was in fact a lie and a hoax, and that the doctors were being released from prison and should have their reputations restored. This would turn out to be the beginning of a lengthy process of de-Stalinization that Khrushchev would oversee as premier, including what would eventually be an official Soviet repudiation of Stalin's excesses and cruelties. For the purposes of this course, it's important to keep in mind that during the frenzied 2 months between the Soviet headlines splashing the fake news of the Doctor's Plot and the public retraction of the whole thing after Stalin's death, Jews in Israel and in the West were terrified that some kind of disaster was about to befall several million Jews, barely 8 years after the Nazi death camps had been shut down. They were well aware that anything, waves of new pogroms, new purges of Jews from ever more professions, or the sentencing of masses of Jews to the Gulag, or even mass deportations, anything was possible. After Stalin's death, there was a regression from the obsessive mania of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism during Stalin's last years. Through the late 50s and early 60s, Cold War alliances took on a more dominant role in shaping Soviet propaganda, as the USSR built alliances with several Arab states, and as Israel became more closely aligned with the West. The 1967 war, in which Israel routed Soviet-backed and supplied Arab states, began a period of re-intensification of official Soviet anti-Zionism as a major international Cold War campaign. One of the elements of this campaign was the accusation that before and during World War II, the Zionists worked in partnership with the Nazis, and that Israel's leaders and contemporary Zionists represented a new version of Nazism. Now, think about this accusation coming from the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s. After all, it was Stalin, not Zionist leaders, who had made a pact with Hitler in the summer of 1939. A pact, as one journalist put it, whose aim was to share the world with Hitler. It was the Hitler-Stalin pact that enabled Hitler to invade Poland on September 1st, 1939, and start World War II. When Poland surrendered, half of it was served up to the Soviet Union. So here we have a case of a government that worked directly and cooperatively with Hitler, accusing the Zionist movement of doing the terrible thing that it, in fact, had done. This is a classic gaslighting form of propaganda. Falsely accuse the people you're trying to discredit of doing the things that you've done, and do it with righteous indignation, and keep repeating it and restating it in many different forms of communication until you have your audience convinced it's the truth. This is what the Soviet Union did on a massive scale from the late 60s to the end of the 80s. So how does all this impact the Jewish narrative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Well, for one thing, as you might expect, millions of Jews who either lived under Soviet rule or who remember the plight of Soviet Jews recognize that something is amiss when the language, tone, and rhetorical style of contemporary criticisms of Israel feel disturbingly familiar. Today, when left-wing criticisms of Israel use the language of imperialism, colonialism, and racism, combined with a certain tone of contempt and moral revulsion, a lot of Jews have their antennae go up. And this illustrates one of the consequences of the Soviet Union's history of lies, disinformation, and utter hypocrisy in the arena of human rights. Their claims about Jews and Zionism have influenced many pro-Palestinian organizations and many international left-wing and radical movements. Let's take a look at a couple examples. First, we'll go back to Stalin's writing from 1913. What is a nation? A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. Among the Jews, there is no large and stable stratum connected with the land, which would naturally rivet the nation together. This is part of Stalin's argument that the Jews should not be considered an actual nation. You can see that language echoed in the Palestinian National Charter, one of the founding documents for the PLO. Claims of historical or religious ties of Jews with Palestine are incompatible with the facts of history and the true conception of what constitutes statehood. Judaism, being a religion, is not an independent nationality, nor do Jews constitute a single nation with an identity of its own. They are citizens of the states to which they belong. So, speaking as a Reconstructionist, where the guiding idea is that Judaism is more than a religion, that it is in fact a civilization, and that Jews do have a coherent collective identity with very deep ties to the historical land of Palestine. I couldn't disagree more with these assertions, and frankly, it's obvious that Jews were not consulted about how they think of themselves. This is an assertion being made by people who do not want Jews to be able to make the claims that would go with being a legitimate nation. We can also see examples of this kind of propaganda being manifested as a call to violence of the grossest kind against Zionists as conspiratorial agents that are a danger to not only the well-being of the communist and socialist world, but really to humanity as a whole. We can see that in some of the propaganda that was popular during the period of the Stalinist show trials. And we can see that rhetoric echoed again in a document like the Hamas Covenant from 1988, where we find world Zionism together with imperialistic powers try through a studied plan and an intelligent strategy to remove one Arab state after another from the circle of the struggle against Zionism in order to have it finally face the Palestinian people only. The Islamic resistance movement calls on Arab and Islamic nations to take up the line of serious and persevering action to prevent the success of this horrendous plan, to warn the people of the danger emanating from leaving the circle of struggle against Zionism. Today it is Palestine, tomorrow it will be one country or another. The Zionist plan is limitless. After Palestine, the Zionists aspire to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates. When they will have digested the region they overtook, they will aspire to further expansion, and so on. Their plan is embodied in the protocols of the elders of Zion, and their present conduct is the best proof of what we are saying. There you go. Not much more to add to that. Progressive Zionists insist that people apply two procedures of thought to criticisms of Israel that sound like the old Soviet propaganda. The first is to question these criticisms vigorously and, if necessary, call out any apparent problems they may see. And the second is to refuse to dismiss these criticisms as entirely baseless simply because they may have some things in common with the games the Soviets used to play with Zionism. Now, that's a lot of work. It's a lot easier to just fall in with some of the pro-Israel folks and say, see, this is all recycled Soviet-era BS. Or to just fall in with some of the pro-Palestine folks who say, so now the Palestinians are supposed to be responsible for the wrongs that the Russians have done to the Jewish people, as well as the wrongs that the Germans have done to the Jewish people. The conflict is about what Zionism has done and is doing to Palestinians without justification. The Jews' problems historically with Europe and Russia were not caused by us. So it's really hard work to actually try to both of those procedures of thought. I want to add something more about how understanding this Soviet history, this history of Stalin's impacts on the conflict is important to the whole bird's eye view versus ground level view dynamic that I've talked about in some of the other sessions of this course, where the Zionist narrative often takes a kind of 30,000 feet up entire global geopolitical view of the status and safety of the Jewish people, whereas Palestinian narratives tend to have more of a ground level view that is focused on the actual lived impacts of the modern Zionist movement on them as a people, impacts of incremental and ongoing dispossession and persecution. So Ben-Gurion and his fellow Zionists were not just thinking about the safety and the viable future of the Jews living in British Mandate Palestine. They were on a mission to rescue Jews around the world whose futures were endangered. Joseph Stalin's lurchings from cautious supporter of Israel to potential deporter of over 2 million Jews living under his rule were on the minds of Ben-Gurion and his circle of political supporters. These concerns affected their decision-making about everything, including about whether or not to allow Palestinian refugees to return to their homes immediately after the 1948 war. I'm not making a moral justification for what Ben-Gurion and the other leaders of the newly founded State of Israel chose to do. I'm just stating a truth about what they were thinking about their situation. The global Jewish community is on their minds at the time, and the ways in which the 20th century had become lethal for Jews by the millions with lightning speed was part of their calculus about how they were going to manage the territory that they had wrested control of in the course of the war. That is very much a Zionist narrative bird's eye view. For Palestinians, the trauma of being stripped of home, land, neighbors, culture, wealth, access to different kinds of jobs and social or political roles was in its early years in the aftermath of the 1948 war. In a Palestinian narrative, the conflict boiled down to organized theft and ethnic cleansing, to mass dispossession, and the Israelis responsible had no idea how resilient and enduring the Palestinians would be to try to reclaim what they had lost.